IoT seminar series. It is my great pleasure today to host and introduce Professor Franzi Roesner. Franzi is an associate professor in computer science and engineering at the University of Washington, where she co-directs the Security and Privacy Research Lab. She's done fascinating work in this area for almost 15 years now. And her work has won many awards, including being named as one of the world's top innovators under 35 by Technology Review, the Emerging Leader Alumni Award from UT Austin, and an NSF Career Award, among many, many others. Without further ado, very excited for your talk, Franzi. Thank you so much for joining us, and the screen is yours.
Great. Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here. As I was saying just beforehand, one of the great benefits of this strange year we've had is that it's so much easier to visit other places. Not as exciting as visiting in person, so I hope we can follow it up with that eventually. But yeah, super excited to be here. Again, I'm an associate professor in the Paul G. Allen School of Computer Science and Engineering at the UW in Seattle. And my research focuses broadly on computer security and privacy. So I co-direct the Security and Privacy Research Lab. And what I'll be talking about today is our work over the last 5 or so years studying smart homes from a human-centered perspective. And I'll dig more into that for the rest of the time. But just briefly to give you a sense of my research in general, my interests are really broad within computer security and privacy. And in fact, that's one of the things that drew me to this field in the first place, is that it's more of a worldview than it is a particular slice of computer science. You can sort of take these questions that we ask in security and privacy and apply them to anything. How might things go wrong? Where will people's expectations be violated? Where are we making assumptions that we don't even realize that we're making that might be violated and have harmful impacts? And of course, how should we design our systems to anticipate and avoid these issues? And so my work focuses broadly around both end user security, so studying people, I'll talk a lot about that today, down to how we should design these systems technically, and crossing a lot of different technology domains. There are other things I could have talked about today, like we've done a lot of work over the last decade or so studying security and privacy for augmented reality platforms. We've also looked at the web, ad, and tracking ecosystem over the last 10 plus years. Yeah, I don't know, it's scary to think about it in terms of time, in terms of my own life perspective. And more recently, looking at problems of online misinformation and disinformation. And I think these things all sound disparate, but to me, they all fall under this umbrella of thinking about how things might go wrong and how we should be designing our systems to bridge this gap between what people need and expect in terms of security and privacy and what our systems are actually doing or might actually do or not do in the future. So in this talk, I'll focus on smart homes. So I think these are, not no longer an emerging technology so much as an emerged technology at this point. I think many of us have these types of devices in our homes. Even I, who as a security and privacy researcher, have an embarrassing number of these types of devices in my home. And in fact, that's not just the case with a set of early adopters at this point, but huge fractions of people across the world. In the US, by some estimates, 40% or more of US households own at least one smart device. And that number goes way up if you consider things like smart TVs as part of that count also. So over the last 5 years, these have exploded. They exist from all sorts of different companies. I'm sure you're all familiar with them. And there are, of course, many potential security and privacy concerns, potential and actual security and privacy concerns. And the perspective that we have taken on this in our work over the past few years is starting with thinking about the people, the end users who are not necessarily technically savvy, who are making choices to bring these devices into their homes and then use them for various things. So the high-level research questions that we've been studying are first, just from foundationally, what are the security and privacy concerns and needs of end users? And that started out as a broad research question several years ago. I'll talk about that first. And one of the big things we found in studying this is that whereas, more technical people like ourselves who might think about, okay, how should we build these systems? How should we defend against complex and sophisticated adversaries. We think a lot about network and embedded system security. We think about remote adversaries. We think about things like the Mirai botnet and so on. But a lot of the issues that we see arising with end users are actually much closer to home, literally. So other people in the home, visitors, other occupants, and so on. So a big area that we've been focusing on since that initial kind of foundational user study work is thinking about smart homes as multi-user systems in particular, and understanding what are the challenges that arise there and how we should be designing smart home devices and platforms in the face of those challenges. And so I'll spend the middle section of the talk talking specifically about this multi-user setting, and then I'll talk a little bit about our design work that we've started doing and iteratively evaluating with people towards this vision of a smart home that centers human security and privacy needs, especially in these multi-user contexts. So these three research questions are what I've structured the talk around. So I'll start out by talking about kind of generally people's concerns, needs, and threat models, and then focus on particularly the multi-user aspect, and especially the need to consider not just end users who are the ones choosing and installing smart home devices, but all the other people living in and passing through the home who don't necessarily have that same level of technical skill or access or interest in the smart home and how they might be impacted. And then I'll turn to the design questions. So starting about 5 or so years ago, was around the time when these types of devices really started taking off. And the question that we often ask in our lab is around the end user needs and concerns for any types of emerging devices. And this is important to understand in conjunction with our technical perspectives on these things, because there are sometimes gaps. We've seen this in other work that we've done. So for instance, a number of years ago, we studied a completely different context, but we studied security and privacy in the context of journalists and how they communicate with and try to protect their sources. And one of the big lessons for me from doing that project in collaboration with Susan McGregor from the Columbia Journalism School and talking with a lot of journalists was really understanding, this gap between what maybe the technical security community says, hey, we could build these things, here's how we could build it, here's who might benefit from it, and so on. The gap between that and what people actually understand and need. And so a lot of my research often starts off with foregrounding people. This has been actually, maybe as a meta comment, has been kind of a trajectory in my own research path over the last 15 years or so. I actually started my undergrad research in computer architecture. I was working on load dependence prediction, and I slowly moved up the computing stack, in part because of some of these lessons I've learned that we really need to understand what people's needs are and what diverse sets of people's needs are to really build things that will solve the right problems. And so in the context of smart homes, we've used these types of methodologies. So I'll be kind of summarizing and highlighting results from a number of different studies that we've done over the years, studying people, both qualitative studies where we've done in-depth interviews with people, talking to them for an hour, or I'll talk later about an in-home study where we actually deployed something for a month in people's homes and then observed what they did and interviewed them about it, as well as some quantitative larger scale studies like survey studies where we can reach a lot more people, but at less depth and with less nuance. And kind of foreshadowing this need to think about different types of smart home users or smart home stakeholders, we started off looking at kind of end users who were early-ish adopters of smart home technologies back in 2017, and then have since then dug more into different types of user groups, like non-primary users who didn't choose to adopt the technologies, children and parents, landlords, tenants, Airbnb hosts and guests, and other contexts. So I'll come back to all of these throughout the talk. So starting with just thinking about end users. So again, these were people who chose to install smart home things, and they were among the early adopters in 2017, early-ish, I guess early of the the commercial wave of these smart home devices. And we really wanted to understand, for these people who are choosing to bring these things into their homes, what are their security and privacy concerns? Where are existing designs not meeting their needs? How can this influence or inform our research trajectory going forward? How do they think these devices work? Where are the gaps between that and what's actually going on? So one observation to highlight is just how different people's mental models can be, both from amongst this group and with, between what end users think and what maybe the designers of these technologies think. And this can influence how much they understand about how the technology works, and how they conceptualize what's going on inside their home can influence what types of things they're concerned about, or maybe not concerned about, that they should be concerned about. So in this study, one thing we did was use this methodology where we asked people to actually draw something that shows us something about their conception of a system. In this case, we asked them to draw out their own smart home setup, so a diagram of how all their devices in their smart home were connected together. And it was really interesting to see kind of the different types of different levels of complexity in how people understood these systems that they had set up in their home. So on the one hand, we had kind of people with very advanced mental models who were really tech savvy, who set up like multiple Wi-Fi networks, segregating different types of devices, who were doing a bunch of custom things with Raspberry Pis. And so this was, I think this was a remote interview that we did even at the time. And so they did this drawing on Google Drawings, or whatever it's called. So this was actually created by a participant. And you can see kind of the level of sophistication here in terms of thinking about not just the end smart devices, but also all the networking infrastructure that they've set up here. And then you kind of have people who fall in between, who aren't thinking so much about the networking layer, but they have an understanding that they've got, the end node smart devices that are connected to some, in this case, the open hub thing might be also connected to a smart things platform, or they had an Amazon Alexa in there in this case. And so they had some understanding that there were some centralized components connecting these different pieces together, and that they were somehow connected, but kind of at an abstraction level above the image on the left. And then, of course, we have some people, even among these early adopters, who were not computer scientists and did not have this level of insight into what was going on in the network. So they had a sense that, they had these apps like the Wemo switches, and they had some smart light bulbs and so on. And they had a sense that these were somehow connected to the apps in their phone, but not really this level of understanding of how these different components fit together. And so the reason that we found this so interesting is that these tended to also correlate with people's mental threat models. So of course, if you have a sense of all the different networking layer components that are part of that, your internal threat model of where adversaries might be sitting and what they might be able to do is much more sophisticated and complete than someone who knows that these things are somehow connected, but doesn't know what's going through the cloud, if anything is going through the cloud at all, and so on. And so this was illuminating for us to just kind of, and I would recommend this actually as a methodology for, rather than asking people directly about their conceptions, ask them to draw it, and then you can kind of see, see the places where there might be gaps in their mental models compared to what we know as technical experts. So stepping back, like I said, there's been a lot of work in smart home security and privacy over the last 5 or so years. And as technical experts, we have these, much more complete threat models where we think about different types of adversaries, like we think about remote attackers who might be getting into our systems through, weak network or embedded system security. We've seen things like the Mirai botnet. I guess that was maybe not so sophisticated in terms of taking advantage of default passwords and so on. But still, to understand what was going on there and to anticipate something like that as a threat, you need a pretty complete mental model of of how these things fit together, not just in the home, but in the entire infrastructure and the entire internet. As security and privacy people, we also think about potential adversaries as, the companies that are making these devices, and potential government entities or other untrusted entities who might be listening or have access to the data later. So the types of questions that security and privacy researchers ask are, if your Amazon Echo is listening to you in your home, what's happening with those audio recordings? When is it listening? How are those protected on Amazon's side? What are Amazon's incentives? What are the roles of third-party apps? What are the roles of Amazon's contractors who might be listening to these recordings, and so on? And so these were things that we expected to hear more about from our participants. And as I'll show you in a minute, we actually heard very little about, or at least these early adopters were not so concerned about these types of adversaries. And I'll tell you more about why. What we heard a lot more of, and what has driven a lot of our work since then, was the adversaries being other physically co-located users, or sometimes physically co-located users, so other people in your home. And that's where we found that there was not a lot of work focused at the time. So that's where we've been focusing a lot of our subsequent work. So going back to what our initial participants thought, like I said, what we found was that they had generally sparse threat models and limited security and privacy concerns. And this was partly likely due to the fact that they were early-ish adopters. They had chosen to bring these things into their homes. And so they had chosen to trust the specific devices that they'd purchased and installed. So for example, while we as security and privacy researchers feel a little bit queasy about all these various companies with different financial incentives listening in our home, participants didn't share those concerns, and they trusted the companies and the reputational pressure they had. So they said things like, well, we're dealing with Amazons and other big companies that are probably not totally irresponsible about privacy and security. And, of course, as security and privacy researchers, we know that things go wrong, and we're skeptical about that. But I think that's also, not an unreasonable assumption to make when you're choosing which devices to buy. People also had sometimes incomplete threat models or mental models about what types of adversaries might even be possible and how they would attack, and whether and why they'd be interested in participants in particular. So we asked people about different mitigation strategies that they might have employed, like technical mitigations. We heard about some, very specific things like segregating different Wi-Fi networks and so on. It was not clear if that those mitigations actually achieved the security goals those people had. But we also asked about behavioral changes, like did people change their behaviors in their homes after bringing an Amazon Echo in or something like that? Did people become uncomfortable, making extreme political arguments in their living room or something like that? And people tended to not be concerned about that either. They said things like, I haven't changed any of my behavior. Even if the government were to get a recording of what's going on in my house, they'll probably just think I'm a weirdo. And again, that is likely a reasonable assumption for this participant who was an early adopter. But you can maybe start to see where this might be headed in our research agenda in terms of, not all people are early adopters who have cause for no concerns. And then, like I said, sometimes people just in their threat models didn't make the full connection. So someone said, for instance, I read some stuff about Hue bulbs being hacked, but I live in a small town. Nobody's going to pull up to my house and do any of that stuff. And so this assumption that an attack requires physical access to the home rather than what we as security researchers might think about, which is a remote adversary on the other side of the globe who's doing this through a more network-based attack. People just didn't feel concerned because in some cases, we might say their threat models are incomplete. But like I said, kind of the key thing that really stuck with us from this study was the importance of thinking about non-primary smart home users. And this was not a research question we initially went in with. We were interested in all of these like more traditional security and privacy issues that we ended up not seeing too much concern about. But kind of by chance, because some of the people that we recruited, I think one person brought with them their spouse to the interview, who then chimed in and started raising some of these concerns or that came out, issues that came out through some of the questions we happened to ask. I'll give some examples. It really highlighted to us that we needed to think not just about these early adopters who were generally pretty tech savvy and had chosen to install these things, but also all of the other people that were impacted by these changes happening in the home. Because, I think over time, as we think about computing, we've moved from, early on computers were rare, scarce resources. They filled up rooms and you had multiple users sharing a single system. We've now moved to, for our personal devices, at least in many of the contexts that we ourselves traffic in, we've got, I'm looking at like 3 devices just from my vantage point here that belong to me personally. But the smart home is moving back into this multi-user setting. And so smart homes are really fascinating to me in the sense in that they are not only multi-user systems, but they are ones that run in our shared physical spaces. So they have this link to the physical world that also fascinates me in my other research, like thinking about augmented reality. And in this shared physical space, we see different classes of users. Like I said, there's different ways to characterize this, but we can kind of break it down as the primary user who set up the home, set up all the accounts. I'm sure that many of you or some of you on this call are those users in your own homes. And you also likely know that smart home systems are heterogeneous. We've got lots of different devices, lots of different platforms. So it's not so simple. There's lots of different accounts to set up, and granting access to other users is not always straightforward, and so on. But then there are other people living in our homes, like partners, children. We need to also think about landlords and tenants or house guests coming through and so on, who don't necessarily have full access to these systems, have different levels of technical understandings of the system, but they're nevertheless deeply affected by the smart homes. And so what we saw, even in just a few of these initial interviews, was potential major differences in power and control between these incidental and these primary users. And we didn't see all of these examples in the initial studies, but they kind of foreshadowed what we saw in later studies or what we can extrapolate. So to dig more into this multi-user question and studying these non-primary smart home users, we did a couple of follow-on studies. I'll give some results that came out of that first study, but also highlight some things that we learned in follow-on studies. So we did actually another interview study subsequently where we focused specifically on studying these non-primary users. And so we recruited participants kind of based on that criteria. We also did a later large-scale survey study looking at Airbnb hosts and guests and the deployment of smart home technologies in Airbnbs. And like I said, we have some results from our initial study as well. And kind of stepping all the way back, thinking about the smart home in a home, we identified a bunch of different places where these multi-user challenges arise. If you think about this pipeline that I've shown as kind of the lifetime of a smart home or a device in the smart home, each of these points here, device selection, device installation, regular device use, and then when things go wrong, things malfunction, or there are conflicts between people, all of these places have decision points where the primary user is making decisions and may or may not be involving the other users, or ways in which non-primary users are impacted by decisions that were made early on or decisions that are made in the process of fixing things. And so you can start to see how different power and control differentials arise here. One thing that we hadn't initially thought of as much, but came up in the context of this study is this last thing on the diagram here, which is the long-term use of devices. It's not just like in many of our homes, we've just deployed these things for a few years, but because they are physically tied to the home, in some cases, for some devices, we will need to think about the long-term futures of these devices where things are changing. And I'll give a few examples. And so for the purposes of this talk, I'll just walk through a few examples of different issues that arose at different places in this pipeline and with different kinds of stakeholders, kind of give you a sense of these different examples. But we see a lot of different things, ranging from differences in access to devices, to the ability to use these devices for surveillance, the fact that current platforms are not well designed for supporting these different types of users or multi-user, the multi-user framework in general. And and all sorts of other issues. And of course, another theme that will recur throughout some of my later comments is that the people who agree to do studies with us are generally in cooperative relationships, and or the stories that they tell us, are generally more lighthearted. So we'll hear about pranks or misunderstandings or, conflicts that were resolved relatively easily. This is all the tip of the iceberg, kind of just the surface level of things that will come to us in a study that people have opted into. There are, of course, all sorts of things that, are certainly going on in homes across the country that would not surface in a study necessarily. So in some cases, we take these concerns and we kind of extrapolate them to much more abusive relationships or other settings. So with that, I might say also, we're not, our goal is not to, I'll show some quotes in a minute. Our goal is not to condemn our participants here. In most cases, the examples that we saw in our actual studies were relatively benign, but they serve as kind of canaries in the coal mine of things that we might be much more concerned about. So anyway, to give you a couple of concrete examples, here's one around from our initial study that kind of surfaced this challenge of having a primary user who has control of the devices and how that might be used or misused in times of conflict with the non-primary users. So this was a case where someone had installed a smart thermostat in their home and they had a conflict with their spouse about the temperature. And so this person said, the primary user said, well, my wife doesn't have access to any of the apps on her phone, and she only controls things through the Echo. And so I actually locked down the thermostat from her specifically because she complains it's hot all the time, and I want her to just turn on the fan because it costs money. And so again, this is, not a, in this case, not a necessarily abusive example, but you can extrapolate how this might be much worse in other contexts. And what I want to highlight in particular in this example is that this is a change, or maybe an existing power dynamic, but it's a change that is exacerbated by the smart home. Previously, things that were controlled by physical switches in the home, we saw other examples with light switches where, the light switches were supposed to be controlled only by the smart home app, according to the primary user, but the secondary user didn't like using the smart home app, and so they kept using the physical switches and messing up the setup, so the person physically taped down the switches. And so that, moving away from the ability to physically control things in your own physical space, is potentially problematic. And so it's important to be thoughtful about how we design these technologies, as we're giving up some of these affordances that gave more equal control to people in the physical spaces. There's also naturally concern around audio and video surveillance. We had one example in the initial study where the person was a student living in a home with other people that was coordinated by someone, and it was intended to be kind of a cool techie home. So they'd set up a bunch of smart devices, including a Nest camera, and they had a party, and somebody unplugged the Nest camera in the kitchen to make room in the outlet for their phone. And the way that the Nest camera worked is that when it was unplugged as a security feature, because you could physically unplug it to, then start stealing things, it automatically took whatever was the last thing it saw and sent an email to the account owner, which was not someone who lived in the home, but the person who coordinated the home. So it ended up inadvertently sending an image of this party to the coordinator. And again, in this case, it was kind of a funny story. The coordinator wasn't mad and was glad that they were having a party and having friends. But it was this unexpected mismatch between the security feature that the camera intended to have, the adversarial model it intended to have, where the physical adversary, the physical unplugger was the adversary, but was violated because the owner of the device was actually not an occupant of the home. And then I also mentioned, how things change over time. And this is something that was highlighted in our later studies. We heard different examples. And for instance, we see examples where, of course, children grow up. As children are young, parents make certain decisions about what types of access they might have. Children, don't necessarily have smartphones. They don't have the ability to control the smart devices. They might be under surveillance, so to speak, through baby monitors and so on. And there are questions about how these policies and norms should change over time and how the technology should anticipate and support those changes. And of course, there are also other examples like relationships ending, people moving in and out, occupants changing. We had one example where a participant moved into an apartment and found that the Nest thermostat actually still had the account from the previous tenant associated with it. And she just removed that old account, but you could see how that could lead to potential privacy violations in other circumstances. And then finally, I mentioned we did a separate study digging into Airbnb in particular, and there's an hour talk I could give just on that, but maybe the most important thing to highlight is that there are, of course, tensions between the needs and the goals of hosts and guests. So on the left, there's a quote from a guest who took our survey who said, I've never logged into the Wi-Fi at an Airbnb with my own device. I just don't trust giving them access to my devices or my internet activity. I also would not want a smart listening device in the rental either. If I saw one, I would disable it for my stay. So the guest feeling like when they have physical access to the home, they are deserving of privacy. And you can contrast that with the situations that many hosts deal with, where they are trying to ensure the safety of their property. And so they have certain house rules like not being able to bring dogs or only having a certain number of guests or not being able to smoke. And so they want to use smart devices in part to be able to detect violations and enforce those. So again, lots more to say, but interesting challenges here and important design challenges in how to resolve these tensions, because there's truth in both of these quotes. So how do we actually design to resolve these tensions and take into account all of these different types of stakeholders? I'll say right now that I don't have the full answer to that. And I think it also depends a lot on the different contexts. There likely is not one solution that will solve all of these different contexts that I've mentioned. But I wanted to share a little bit about a study we did where we actually built a prototype and then deployed it in people's homes, and some interesting lessons I think that we learned from that. So going into this study, one of the things that we did was look at what was the existing multi-user support in existing smart home platforms. And this was a couple of years ago, so it may have changed since then. I'm actually not totally current on what exactly this looks like today, so this may have improved. But certainly at the time, multi-user support was very limited and kind of after the fact. So for instance, Samsung SmartThings didn't really have a good permission model. It only allowed you to create additional users and then grant them access to everything. So you'd find, for instance, on SmartThings forums, people who said things like, how do I grant access to my teenagers only to certain devices, but not to all of them, because they are messing with each other. And so I want to restrict their access, but they also need to be able to control the devices in their own rooms. Apple HomeKit had a bit more sophisticated model. They did have various remote access and admin permissions. But as you'll see in a minute, there are a lot of other potential access control models and different flexibilities that might be needed that aren't supported by this simple model. And then, of course, things like the Amazon Echo or the Google Home that are voice assistants listening for voice commands, for various reasons that include deep technical challenges, don't have sophisticated user authentication. Once you've linked an account, anybody who's physically in the home can communicate with those devices, and there's not much additional authentication that's done there. So really, a lot of this multi-user support was either not present or kind of an afterthought, and didn't really take into account these really actually deeply complex issues with different types of stakeholders. So kind of through this analysis of existing platforms and our own experiences in our prior studies, as well as a systematization of other related work that had looked at smart homes or smart devices over the years, we proposed a set of design principles for a smart home that we then prototyped. And one thing I'll highlight here is that in our initial work, we really thought about, like I said, generally cooperative households. And this is by no means does this solve the entire problem. I mentioned we need to think also deeply about sophisticated and really harmful adversaries like domestic abuse settings and so on. But one thing that struck us when we were doing this work is that the domestic abuse threat model is really extremely challenging. You have a sophisticated adversary with physical access. That's really hard to solve. But even in the generally cooperative households, we're where we see the stories that I've just given examples of, this problem wasn't solved. So even in this so-called easy case, we don't have a solution. So that's what we focused on initially. And so we proposed this set of design principles, or hypothesized a set of design principles that we then implemented in a prototype. So the first is access control flexibility, so allowing different types of access control models. Transparency of smart home behaviors, so allowing people, including non-primary users, to understand how it's being used and who's using it. And then I'll focus in the rest of this talk most on these last two, so user agency, so allowing users the agency to act in their own homes and control their own homes, again with a bit of a focus here on or inspiration from the non-primary users, so the ability to have control of your own physical space. And then designing to promote respect among users, especially in these generally cooperative households. People, often have good intentions, but with the existing designs, it's hard to necessarily act on those intentions because they've not been designed with multi-user nuanced interactions in mind. So kind of taking these design principles, we built a prototype that was a smartphone app that was a controller for a smart home. So it integrated with Samsung SmartThings and through to various devices through that. And we implemented various features based on our proposed design principles, different types of access control mechanisms, different types of notifications to users, localizing people to different rooms and so on. And I'll highlight just a few of those features and how they were tied to our initial design principles. If you're interested in taking a closer look at it, we have not tested it recently if it runs with the latest version of SmartThings, but we did open source the code, and we definitely would welcome any of you to take a look and build on it or give us feedback. So to just highlight a few design features here. So thinking about designing for respectful usage, so helping co-occupants of a home act in ways that are respectful to each other. One of the features that we implemented was location-based access controls. So trying to emulate the properties that we get just naturally from the physical world. If someone is not in the room, they are not able to control your lights. And if they're in the room with you, then they are able to control your lights, and you can see that they're doing it, and it's, it's not weird. So we implemented location-based access controls that would allow users to make certain devices not remote controllable. Of course, this is, as with any access controls or any security controls, this can be in tension with functionality. So one of the things that we found was that this is in tension with some people's functionality goals in having a smart home, because remote control is sometimes the very feature that you want from a smart home. But if you've got people in the home and people outside of the home, they may be in tension with what they want. And so we wanted to support both this option, but also the idea of having people in the home be able to, I'll talk about it again in a moment, but people in the home be able to kind of give ad hoc authorization for things that remote users were trying to do. In terms of transparency, we also showed activity notifications so that people could see who or what caused a device's state to change. And so again, kind of emulating what we see in the physical world. If someone switches on the light in your living room, you've physically seen who that was and that they've done it. And this kind of drives respectful usage. It's much harder to prank someone if they are watching you do it. And we also had support for other types of access controls, like role-based access controls, like setting restrictions on guests or parental controls, or restrictions on private rooms, like your own bedroom. You can control things in your bedroom, but not your sibling's bedroom, and so on. So the other principle I wanted to highlight is designing for user agency. So ensuring that people could still do things in their own homes. So one is what I just mentioned, which is, allowing access on certain occasions. So for instance, allowing access if someone else is nearby, like maybe when the kid is home, they're not allowed access to certain devices like the smart TV, but when someone else is nearby, without requiring further interaction from any of the people, when the parent is there to supervise that access is unlocked. Likewise, this is actually what I mentioned before, reactive access control. So if I am remotely trying to turn off the lights and you are in the room, rather than just denying me, or rather than just overriding your agency as the person in the room, we'll ask you for permission just at that moment. And then finally, one of the challenges that we saw a lot was that people who came to the smart home who weren't active users of it, like guests or people who couldn't be bothered to install the 17 apps you need to control it, had trouble interfacing with the smart home at all. So we experimented with ways of surfacing to people that there are even smart devices here. So showing these discovery notifications that kind of stay active in your notification bar and tell you which devices are nearby and allow you to control them without having to necessarily install all the different apps. So let me briefly give you some of the high-level lessons that we learned from deploying this, and I want to make sure to leave some time for questions. So very briefly, this was a very iterative study, and I would definitely also thank my student Eric Zhang, who led this study, for really pushing us to do this in an iterative way and not just saying, okay, we learned these things from our previous study, let's build something and then be done with it, but actually taking it back to the people, not the people that we had previously interviewed literally, but taking it back to people and deploying it and seeing whether our hypotheses about these design principles and these features actually turned out to be valuable. And so we recruited a number of homes who had, or families with different types of relationships, including kind of nuclear families, roommates, and kind of in different places in the Seattle area. We actually gave them smart devices to install in their home that would work with our prototype. We interviewed them and helped them set them up, and then they used the smart home with our smarter app interface for 4 weeks, and we observed which features they used and so on, and then did an exit interview with them at the end. And I think we learned a few really interesting things that have influenced our thoughts about where to go from here. I think we went into this, and maybe this is the same lesson that technologists learn when they talk to users over and over again. But we went into this building all of these different access control features that were based on what we had learned from previous studies, what we had learned from previous work, and that were tied to our design principles. And honestly, what we found is that people did not use them very much, despite our best efforts in making them accessible and usable and matching different potential, giving them the flexibility to match different potential flexible use cases and stakeholders and so on. And one of the big reasons for that this is the thing that has stuck with me the most from this study, is how much respectful usage between household members in our study was guided by existing social norms rather than by any of the software features that we built. So in some sense, the software features were redundant to the social norms that people developed interpersonally as they set it up and then they used it. And again, I want to really emphasize that these were generally cooperative households. These were households that agreed together to enroll in our study, sign our consent form, and so on. So this is certainly in part a selection bias in who participated in the study. So I don't want to say that this is the solution for all types of homes and all types of relationships. But again, this is a common type of home for which we didn't have good solutions before, and still don't have good solutions. So generally, we found that after the initial exploratory period where people were maybe pranking each other and trying different things out, people trusted each other and were guided by social norms, like you don't flip on the lights in someone else's bedroom. So they didn't actually set up, for instance, room-based access controls. They just trusted each other not to do it. And even in cases where more tech-savvy participants were aware of ways to violate privacy, like you can use the Alexa, the Amazon Alexa logs to see what others have said to the device, they chose not to do so because of, again, the social norms guiding these relationships in general. So to give you one example, we asked about the use or the lack of use of parental controls in one of the homes where the family had a teenager. And the mom said, right, if my son were a different person, I might not have given him permission to turn off the alerts for the windows and the doors. As it is, he follows the rules exactly, so I was not worried about it. If he'd been me, if I was a teenager, I would have turned off my own permissions. So of course, social norms don't always work. But I think we were surprised at just how much these social norms obviated the need for the technical access controls, and has given us a lot to think about in terms of how we should design these platforms going forward to kind of guide these social norms or elicit these social norms as part of maybe the installation process or the further usage process. And likewise, we saw a lot of these norms were inherited from physical space. So norms from kind of the dumb home, the non-smart home, sometimes transferred over. So again, people had no access control preferences for smart devices that were placed in common areas. And they took these assumptions that they had from the physical space that anybody can access things, or they weren't interested in seeing activity notifications about things that happened when they were also there, because they didn't find that they learned anything more than they could just physically see anyway. So ways in which the smart home did not change things led to people kind of being able to transfer those existing assumptions. So we asked, did you use location-based access controls to restrict the kids from controlling the lights? And they said, no, I don't think we had a need for that. In the past, they could just control them manually. And we weren't concerned about them controlling them remotely. So, in some sense, some of these findings were a bit negative in the sense that we found that the things that we built and had put a lot of effort into building were not actually widely used by our participants. But like I said, they've given us a lot of insight in terms of what did and didn't work. And, rather than building kind of this complex set of flexible access controls, thinking a bit more broadly about how these platforms might be able to build on these norms inherited from physical space, or elicit or guide the development of social norms within these generally cooperative households through kind of totally different strategies than just literal access controls. So to summarize a little bit before I take questions, I have a slide here on design recommendations that is maybe also it doubles as kind of what are the takeaway lessons that have really stuck with me through the series of studies that we've done, talking to people and deploying in people's homes and so on. And I think, these are design recommendations for smart home manufacturers, smart home platform and device manufacturers, but also for us as researchers thinking about, where are the challenges here? Some of these design recommendations are quite vague in the sense that I don't know yet how to realize the design recommendation. So for instance, the first one is to minimize power differences, this power differential between the primary user and non-primary users of the home. This recommendation does not hold within it a blueprint of how to do that. But what we've learned is that this is a really critical value to think about as we're designing these systems. And in particular, considering the non-primary users and different types of stakeholders, not just nuclear families, but also roommates, landlords, tenants, and so on. I'm also highlighting again the need to design for long-term changes, especially for some smart devices like appliances. They may be in the home for long periods of time, long outlasting short-term tenants there. Or of course, in the settings of Airbnbs, the tenants' terms are very short. So thinking about anticipating and designing for these changes will help us avoid kind of unexpected consequences. It's also, of course, very hard to do. These companies are trying to get these things out and deployed and used. In some cases, what we really want to do is actually think about 30-year time horizons. As I said, I think one thing that's really stuck with me that I've been thinking more about recently is thinking about how to design to help promote these positive social norms, like the ones we saw in our maybe above average cooperative households that participated in our studies. But alongside that, I think there is still a need to implement kind of basic usable multi-user features that we have seen a scarcity of in existing deployed systems. Perhaps part of the reason that people use these social norms is because our system was too hard to use, or because they had already developed some of those social norms with the existing smart home platforms that they had that didn't even support multi-users in a very nuanced way. So things like access and privacy controls, authentication, integration of different platforms and accounts and so on. All of these are things that can kind of exponentially get complicated as you think about the matrix of different access controls and users and so on. And so I think there's more work to do there in making that really, really usable and useful. And one additional challenge we saw around this that kind of leads into all these other issues is that user onboarding is incredibly challenging. Part of the reason we see these power differentials is that the non-primary users are not getting on the platforms. There's multiple apps, there's different accounts. Often people are just sharing account credentials. Again, lots of different things that we see with different platforms. But that's a big challenge that we saw. And then finally, I just want to come back to this really important point, to which I don't have a solution, but I want to make sure that we're not forgetting about, which is that while we need to be solving the problems for generally cooperative households, in designing these technologies, we also need to be really careful to consider abusive non-cooperative households, or other situations where things like social norms are certainly not enough, and we're dealing with really powerful adversaries. So there are others who are doing work in that space more broadly and with smart homes in particular. I just want to make sure that as we're thinking about this space, we're thinking about this whole set of threat models, including really strong adversaries and also the weaker adversaries for whom we're not yet designing well either. So with that, I hope we'll have a little bit of time for questions. Just to recap briefly, I've told you about this research trajectory over the last few years of understanding people's needs, focusing on multi-user smart homes in particular, and then thinking about how we should design. And I've highlighted towards on this slide because, like I said, we're not there yet. We don't have the proposal for the perfect smart home that takes into account all of these different user groups and resolves all of these tensions and so on. And I'm not sure that there is one single such design, but we're still thinking about it. And I would certainly invite all of you to think about it. I'd love to hear your thoughts. All of this work was, of course, done in collaboration with a lot of great people whose slides in part I have stolen to make this talk. So thanks especially to Eric and Christine for that. This is a space that we're still actively thinking about. So I'd love to hear your thoughts, hear about potential collaborations. If you're an undergraduate student thinking about working in this space in grad school, I'd love to chat about that. And with just a little bit of time, I will wrap it up. I'm happy to be contacted also outside of today and chat more about these things.
Franzi, thank you so much for a fantastic talk. Very exciting work. I enjoyed a lot of it. We'll have time for a few questions. So if folks want to ask questions, please raise your hand and I will kick it off with a couple of my own. So one question is, as you were doing these interviews across the stage as well as with deployments, did you notice any patterns when it comes especially to different racial differences or gender differences, and how did that how were some of the findings that you might have seen? Or I don't know how large the studies have been so far, or what important directions you consider. That's one question that I had as you were sharing insights.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And I can partly answer that and partly not answer it, because often for these qualitative studies, the samples are small. For qualitative research methodologies, often the goal is not to get necessarily a representative sample and make generalizable claims, but to surface issues and surface different themes that you can then go forward with. So the samples are not large enough to make any generalizable claims like that. And in particular, did not have good representation of things like racial diversity. So I think those are fantastic and important questions that we need to continue studying. I can speak a bit to the gender differences. Again, I'd be, it would be methodologically unsound to claim that these results are generalizable, but I think we saw it a lot, and I think it also will probably jive with many of your experiences, is that there tended to be gender differences in who was the primary and who was the non-primary users. We also saw counterexamples, but typically we found that men were primary users who brought all this stuff in the smart home, and then their female partners kind of were along for the ride, or in some cases not thrilled about it. And so we tended to see that gender breakdown there. And I think there's other work that has confirmed that. And I would hypothesize that we would see that in a larger sample too.
Well, great. Thanks a lot for your response. I want to also ask you a little bit to share with the audience. I know you've worked in so many different areas, including now you're exploring a lot of AR, but actually one thing that I wanted to hear a little bit, perhaps you can share, and then we'll take more questions from the audience on some of the work that you've done for security and privacy in interactions between victim service providers and human trafficking survivors. So maybe you could tell us just a little bit about that work, because I know it's also a completely different direction, and I'd love to use this platform also to share it with people.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the types of work that I've been doing over the last several years has been studying not just people and security and privacy, but studying particularly vulnerable user groups. So I mentioned earlier that we did a series of work studying journalists and their communication with sources. We've also studied, as you mentioned, the interaction of victim service providers with survivors of human trafficking. And in particular, there again, our questions are about technology. So how is technology used to mediate those interactions? What are the security and privacy concerns that, for instance, victim service providers have when they're communicating with trafficking victims who are maybe still trying to escape, and so on. We've also looked at refugees who have resettled in the US and who are trying to establish things like, email accounts and to apply for jobs and so on, and who also have different threat models. And at a high level, one of the things I've learned is that while there are some similarities in all of these settings, it's really important to understand kind of the very specific nuances of the specific user groups and where things break down for them. Maybe unfortunately for technologists, among which I would count myself, often what we find is a little bit hard to act on. So we often go in hoping to find something that's like, okay, here's the missing piece, and if we just built this, it would help. And often we find that it's much more complicated than that. Sometimes we have ideas like that, but often we find things like there are just really fundamentally hard tensions. Like for the trafficking survivors, one important tension is that technology can be used as a way to re-victimize them or track them by their trafficker. So for instance, the use of social media accounts to message victim service providers can be risky. Or even being on social media at all. But of course, that is also how people kind of reestablish their normal lives and a sense of normalcy and communication with our support networks and so on. So if I were to give maybe the one sentence summary of what I've learned in all these different contexts, is that there are always these really, really difficult to resolve tensions.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing that work with us. A question from the audience. Steve, you have your hand raised if you want to unmute and ask the question.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for coming. I was hoping you could look in your crystal ball. We just had the pipeline hacker malware come in, and if you could, based upon your experience, talk to how you expect this power dynamic and the adoption and people's perception of smart devices in the home. How do you expect it's going to mature, in the future? Pick whichever future you want to talk to now, 5 days, 5 years, 5 millennia.
Yes, yeah, thanks, Steve. That's a really interesting set of issues there. So maybe two thoughts immediately come to mind. One is that, I think we've seen, I think these ransomware attacks are an interesting example of kind of how often the attacks are not as sophisticated as we maybe think about at the forefront of technical security and privacy research, but the impacts can be really dramatic. And so, I think we've been seeing more and more of these types of ransomware attacks, and I would expect us to continue seeing that. I think that's one of the risks maybe that hasn't really come up in our work, but is certainly parallel, is what, when everything is computerized. We often saw things that were harmed by kind of accidental failures, like, the internet went out and then, your lights didn't work anymore, or you set up the access control wrong. And I think we had one example where a family had set up some sophisticated location-based access controls, and then their kids and the nanny ended up in like a dark house. And so these kind of accidents are maybe the foreshadowings of things we might see adversaries do as things are more and more connected. And yeah, maybe the other, you mentioned people's perceptions. And so I wanted to react to that, because I think things like this pipeline attack are really interesting, or almost hopeful to me, in the sense that raising people's general awareness about these issues can be really valuable. We've seen this in other contexts, like social media and web privacy. Like 10 years ago or something like that, maybe more, the refrain was always privacy is dead. And if you don't want it, don't want people to know about it, don't put it on the internet. And I think we've moved on from that. Privacy researchers never thought that. I certainly never thought that. But it made sense that people thought that, because privacy is a very abstract harm. It's kind of unclear, if somebody knows which websites I visit, who cares? It's not that sensitive. And I think it's only when people saw through things like the Cambridge Analytica scandal, and as machine learning models have developed since then, and we, kind of the general public sees the potential power of these things, that I don't think anybody is saying privacy is dead anymore, or maybe if it is dead, people aren't happy about it. And so I think the pipeline attack is something like that kind of can raise the awareness and can change how people are thinking about these things in a positive way, or positive being moving us towards, better security and privacy because end users care about it.
Thanks. And I enjoyed your talk.
Yeah, thanks so much for being here.
Franzi, one last technical question, since the questions that I asked before were a little bit more meta. How did you, like when it comes to location-based services, how do you determine location? Because indoor localization is a technically hard problem.
Yes. Yeah, we cheated essentially by using Bluetooth beacons that we deployed in people's homes. So we did not learn it from scratch or anything like that. We just and then we just dealt with the potential errors in the rings.
Right, because I mean, a Bluetooth beacon, it could still be like on the other side of the wall. I mean, localization systems are evolving, of course, but indoor localization is still a very hard problem.
Yeah, absolutely. And we did not try to solve it. We said, people like you are perhaps trying to solve it.
Although with the AirTag, I actually think that type of problem for smart home applications with the AirTag type technology is going to be solved, I think, very soon, because it is an actually powerful technology.
Yeah, no, and I think, we could talk a lot more about that and its relationship to smart homes and augmented reality. And yeah, super interesting.
Great. Okay.